Hey, hey, hey. Hey everyone, we are continuing to read this beautiful book of Zupancic after God knows how long, like a year. I I didn't do it, but let's move on and just pretend that this gap didn't happen. All of it is synchronic, so doesn't really matter. And we'll be continuing on so we are at the chapter 4 and let's get straight into it. From the logic of illusion to the postulates. The stormy ocean of illusion. We now go on to examine those things that Kant designates with the general name of transcendental ideas, so that we can deduce from them the logic and function of the postulates of pure practical reason. The transcendental ideas, which Kant also calls entia rationis, heuristic fictions, concepts of reason, regulative ideas, belong to the realm of thought, which opens up with the second part of the Critique of Pure Reason, the transcendental dialectic. If, in the transcendental analytic, we were dealing with the logic of truth, the transcendental dialectic confronts us with the logic of illusion. Both designations are Kant's. We might, on the other hand, equally say that these two parts of the first critique deal with two different logics of truth. In the former, truth is understood as the conformity of knowledge to its object, while in the latter, truth is conceived of as the conformity of knowledge with itself. In other words, the logic of truth deals with the classical theory of truth, adequatio intellectus et rei, whereas the logic of illusion is closer to the Lacanian conception of truth, according to which truth is to be situated on the level of the articulation of the signifiers as such, and not on the level of the relationship between signifiers, words, and things, as simply exterior to them. It is precisely this lack of externality, the non-existence of a limit, which accounts for the fact that truth has, as Lacan insists, the structure of fiction, and that it is not whole, pas tout. Yet this fictional character of truth in no way implies that the truth is arbitrary. And this is crucial. I'm breaking from the text comment. This point which she makes is so crucial because the logic of illusion and the fact that in this second conception of truth, which is not correspondence, not truth which corresponds to an external object, but truth which marks the point at which knowledge corresponds to itself, that we don't pass to some kind of falsity. Kant talks about illusion, but this does not mean that there is pure arbitrariness. The fact that we are moving now not on the plane of signifiers connecting to objects or words connecting to reality, we are now dealing with signifiers connecting to signifiers, or words connecting to words. And this does not mean that now everything will be how we want it to be. There is a logic inherent in the structure of signification as such. There is a logic in knowledge as such. There are rules in knowledge as such, which make it so that we can't just arbitrarily decide anything. There is maybe even a stricter logic when we drop the concept of external object than in correspondence conception of truth itself. Okay, let's move on. Maybe she'll repeat what I just said. Yet this fictional character of the truth in no way implies that the truth is arbitrary. This is also true for the transcendental ideas. On the one hand, reason is free of any direct link to things, objects of experience. It deals only with concepts, of the understanding, placing them in different configurations and combinations. On the other hand, it turns out that nothing is less free than this free play with concepts. Yeah. This is Kant's starting point in the transcendental dialectic. Since it operates independently of experience, reason seems capable of producing any kind of phantasm it pleases. But instead of this being the case, if we consider the history of philosophy, we find that it systematically produces the same ideas again and again. The ideas of the soul, of the world as a whole, and of God. From this eternal return of the same, from this compulsion to repeat, Kant concludes that these ideas must be necessary. In the structure of the human mind, there is something which necessarily leads to this, and precisely these ideas. Although Kant takes as his starting point the classical theory of truth, which defines truth as the conformity of knowledge to its object, it is also clear that Kantian philosophy, which in many ways departs significantly from classical philosophy, cannot be classified with such a definition of truth, implying, as it does, a pre-Kantian conception of the relation between subject and object. The object to which knowledge has to correspond can only be an object of possible experience, which means that such an object is already mediated by the a priori subjective conditions of sensibility. Moreover, Kant establishes as the conditio sine qua non, as the negative condition of any truth, a logical criterion, which he defines as conformity of knowledge to the general and formal laws of understanding and reason. The conditio sine qua non of any truth is thus the conformity of knowledge with itself, and the question of the conformity of knowledge to the object comes only later. It is possible to see in what Kant calls the formal criterion of truth the necessary background of the distinction between true and false. That is to say, what we call false or untrue also has to satisfy the formal criterion of truth in order for us to be able to recognize it as false. The formal criterion of truth has to be satisfied if we are to be able even to ask about the truthfulness or falsehood of any possible statement. If this is not the case, whatever it is we are considering cannot even be false. It can only be what Kant calls an Unding, a non-thing, such as, for example, a square circle. In these terms, the dialectic or the logic of illusion is to be defined as the pretension to arrive, via pure logic, at material truth. Truth in the ordinary sense of the word, the conformity of knowledge to things. And maybe a little break from the text. So these two levels, the level of formal truth. So the formal level is basically the conditions, the formal conditions which make it so that any object of experience can be experienced at all. So that's why the square circle is mentioned here. This object is not, we can think these words as square circle, but for Kant it does not make for a possible object of experience, so it does not satisfy formal conditions of truth. We cannot say false or true things about it for Kant, and this is the level of knowledge corresponding to itself. It doesn't right here. We are not even on the level of the external object. So asking if there are square circles is like like a mistake from the start at this point, because we cannot even pretend to be like, can we find square circles? No, this concept does not even like satisfy formal conditions of experience, so we can know necessarily that there are no such things. And we cannot say false or true things about them, because they are unding. And additionally, when we are making this judgment about the square circle being a known thing, we are not on the level of the correspondence theory of truth, precisely because we are not talking about the external object, that this object is impossible. No, we are talking about our knowledge. At this point, it breaks down, and we are not talking about any possible like external object. Yeah, we are just marking off where our subjective conditions of experience like break down, what they do not allow. Let's continue. In these terms, the dialectic or the logic of illusion is to be defined as the pretension to arrive via pure logic at material truth. Truth in the ordinary sense of the word, the conformity of knowledge to things. The logic of illusion claims to deduce from the negative condition of truth, which functions only to establish the possibility or impossibility of truth. This cannot be true because it is logically contradictory. That could be true because it involves no contradiction. Its objective value. In other words, the logic of illusion induces us to hold that something is true because, and only because, it is not impossible from the logical point of view. In relation to the analytic, the dialectic is thus defined through a double play of the not enough and the too much. The dialectic illusion equals the analytic truth minus the object of possible experience. The dialectic illusion equals the analytic truth plus an object that cannot be found anywhere at all in experience. As a result, illusion is not the opposite of truth, but must instead be situated on another level. Dialectical illusion is something that appears where there should in fact be nothing. In other words, this illusion is an object in the place of the lack of an object. We thus have a formal logical structure, the conformity of knowledge to the general and formal laws of understanding and reason, in which there is a place for an object, which is missing from its place, i.e. cannot be found in experience. This means that dialectical illusion is not really the illusion of something. It is not a false or distorted representation of a real object. Behind this illusion, there is no real object. There is only nothing, the lack of an object. The illusion consists of something in the place of nothing. It does not involve a deception in which something is falsely represented. It involves deception by the simple fact that it is. Transcendental illusion has to do not with the content of an image, but with its very existence. It deceives on the level of being. In this respect, the Kantian concept of transcendental illusion is very close to the Lacanian concept of le semblant. If we are to give a fair reading of Kant's conception of transcendental ideas, we must begin their examination one step before the beginning. Not at the beginning of the dialectic, but at the end of the analytic, where Kant lays out his famous map of the territory of understanding and describes the sublime view that opens to the inhabitant of this territory as she looks beyond it. Kant quote: We have now not merely explored the territory of pure understanding and carefully surveyed every part of it, but we have also measured its extent and assigned to everything in it its rightful place. This domain is an island, enclosed by nature itself within unalterable limits. It is the land of truth, enchanting name, surrounded by a wide and stormy ocean, the native home of illusion, where many a fog bank and many a swiftly melting iceberg give the deceptive appearance of farther shores, deluding the adventurous seafarer ever anew, with empty hopes, and engaging him in enterprises which he can never abandon, and yet is unable to carry to completion. End of quote. An island of truth in wide and agitated ocean of illusion. This then is the description of the state of things at the end of the analytic. Once we have covered and measured the land which bears the enchanting name of truth, this land loses its charm for adventurous spirits, and they take off to seek adventure elsewhere. But they do not know that they are headed only towards their own ruin. The image Kant uses to accentuate the importance of this particular point of the critique of pure reason deserve examination on their own. In this context, let us indicate just one possible reading, the one that turns on the distinction between the beautiful and the sublime, the difference between a natural world, in which everything seems to be in its perfect place, where harmony reigns, and a chaotic nature, full of sudden and unexpected eruptions, between a nature which makes us feel safe and comfortable, and the beautiful, and a nature which leads us beyond the pleasure principle, toying with us as the wind toys with a grain of sand, the sublime. If we bear in mind Kant's life, the unchanging routine and order of his everyday habits, and above all the fact that he never, not even once, left his native Königsberg, we could say first that he has elevated fidelity to his land of truth to the level of the ethics of existence. And second, that this therefore enables us to imagine how dramatic must have been the emotions which buffeted Kant when, in his philosophical journey, he decided to leave the land of truth behind and to cast off out onto the stormy ocean of the dialectic. We will see, however, that later this Kantian story takes a somewhat unexpected and surprising turn. As a matter of fact, it is interesting to observe how, after such dramatic announcements, evocative of dread and fascination, our expectations are left mostly unfulfilled. Nothing too spectacular happens in the dialectic. Instead of chaos, we encounter a systematic unity. Instead of the intrusion of the real, we get the transcendental idea. Reason does not in fact lead the understanding to its ruin, but rather provides coherence to the concepts produced by the understanding, in spite of the fact that all this happens in the land of illusion. In what follows, we will examine in detail just one of the transcendental ideas, the one that follows from the paralogism of personality. Person also means mask. We find these words in Kant's Opus Posthumum, in the section dealing with the transcendental ideas. This etymological link is also pointed out by Lacan in his Remarks on the report by Daniel Lagache, Psychoanalysis and Structure of Personality. Lacan stresses that there is more than an etymological play involved. What is at stake is the evocation of the ambiguity of the process by means of which the concept came to embody a unity that is supposed to assert itself in being. Être. He means the concept of the person. It is difficult to overlook the Kantian echo of these words, which describe in their own way the same notion as a transcendental idea. A concept that embodies a unity that seems as if it really exists in the world of what is, in being. Let us then consider the paralogism of personality. Kant formulates it as follows. That which is conscious of the numerical identity of itself at different times is, in this regard, a person. It is important to stress that this paralogism is part of what Kant calls illusion, shine. But it is nevertheless an inevitable and necessary conclusion of reason. In other words, the inference, Schluss, about personality is a spontaneous ideology of this thinking subject. According to Kant's critique of this paralogism, the conclusion about our identity amounts to this. For the whole of the time in which I am conscious of myself, I am conscious of this time as belonging to the unity of myself. And, quote, it comes to the same whether I say that this whole time is in me as individual unity, or that I am to be found as numerically identical in all this time. End of quote. The point here is that I cannot think the one without the other. So if I want to observe the mere I in the flux of representations, I can refer to no other correlatum except, once again, myself. The identity of self-consciousness at different times is only a formal condition of my thoughts and their coherence. The transcendental unity of a perception. And the identity of the person in no wise follows from the logical identity of the I. Of course, it would be a different matter if this identity could appear and be observed from outside, in the form of outer sense. But this is not the case, even if we introduce a second person. Quote, but if I view myself from the standpoint of another person, as object of his outer intuition, it is this outer observer who first represents me in time. For in the apperception, time is represented, strictly speaking, only in me. Although he admits, therefore, the I, which accompanies, and indeed with complete identity, all representations at all times in my consciousness, he will draw no inference from this to the objective permanence of myself. For just as the time in which the observer sets me is not the time of my own, but of his sensibility, so the identity which is necessarily bound up with my consciousness is therefore not bound up with his. That is, with the consciousness which contains the outer intuition of my subject. End of quote. To put this more simply, the fact that somebody else views me as an object of his outer intuition does not yet permit me to draw any conclusions about my identity. Such an inference would be possible only if I were able to put myself in the very place from which I am being observed. If I were able to view myself at the same time as object of inner and outer intuition. If I were able to see myself the way the other sees me. This is precisely what the transcendental idea of personality provides the conceptual framework for. Yet, by formulating things in this way, we have reached not only the transcendental idea, which corresponds to the paralogism of personality, but also the Lacanian conception of the ego ideal as the way I see the other seeing me. It should be pointed out, however, that this conceptual constellation is not confined to psychological ideas. The idea of personality falls under the rubric psychological ideas, but is, at least in one sense, paradigmatic for the transcendental ideas in general. Whenever Kant speaks about transcendental ideas, he does so by using visual metaphors that describe the very configuration we are discussing here. All transcendental ideas express a certain relationship between understanding and reason. The creation of concepts and series of concepts, on the one hand, and the ordering and uniting of these concepts into totalities, on the other, are two distinct tasks distributed between the understanding and reason. The understanding is absorbed in the task of the creation of concepts, and therefore never has in view, the expression is Kant's, their totality. This totality can be seen only from the point of view of reason. Yet, if the standpoint of reason is to have any impact on the process of attaining knowledge, as it always has, albeit only in regulative manner, this conception of two mutually exclusive points of view is not sufficient. On the contrary, the understanding has to perform its job as if it shared with one of its eyes the point of view of reason. If reason is to have any impact on the work of the understanding via transcendental ideas as regulative principles, the transcendental idea in its most general sense can be nothing but the way the understanding sees itself being seen by reason. Let me read this again. If reason is to have any impact on the work of the understanding via transcendental ideas as regulative principles, the transcendental idea in its most general sense can be nothing but the way the understanding sees itself being seen by reason. Consider the passage from the chapter, The Regulative Employment of the Ideas of Pure Reason. Kant quote: "Transcendental ideas have an excellent, and indeed indispensably necessary, regulative employment, namely, that of directing the understanding towards a certain goal upon which the routes marked out by its rules converge, as upon their point of intersection. This point is indeed a mere idea, a focus imaginarius, from which, since it lies outside the bounds of possible experience, the concepts of the understanding do not in reality proceed. Nonetheless, it serves to give to these concepts the greatest possible unity, combined with the greatest possible extension. Hence arises the illusion that the lines have their source in a real object lying outside the field of empirically possible knowledge, just as objects reflected in a mirror are seen as behind it. Nevertheless, this illusion is indispensably necessary. If, besides the objects which lie before our eyes, we are able to see those which lie at a distance behind our back." End of quote. Is there any better way of conceiving the situation described by Kant than to refer to Lacan's famous optical tableau? This is a schema that Lacan borrowed from Bose, with some modifications, and used on several occasions to illustrate some of his concepts. The difference between ideal ego and ego ideal, and the passage from the imaginary to the symbolic. Let us first examine the left part of the schema, the section on the left side of the flat mirror, O for the other. There is a spherical. Let me do a thing. Let me do a thing. Here we go. I pulled up the schema because this may be so convoluted that this will not be understandable even with the schema, but it can't. I think it will help. Okay. Let us first examine the left part of the schema, the section on the left side of the flat mirror. O for other. There is a spherical mirror, XY, in front of which a prop is placed, with flowers fixed on it. Given that this schema could be seen as a purely conceptual model, it is possible to substitute the flowers with what interests us in the present discussion. Let us imagine that the flowers stand for a series of concepts created by understanding, or for the assemblage of the multiple I thinks that accompany at different times each of my representations. Inside the prop there is a vase turned upside down, that is the nothing with something around it, which is perhaps not a bad representation of what Kant calls the transcendental unity of apperception. And so nothing with something around it, transcendental unity of apperception. Insofar as it is only a formal or logical unity, it is the one thought that I can never see as an independent thought, because everything I think through it, and it can therefore never be an object of my immediate consideration. If one were to place an observer, ourselves, for instance, in the upper right hand corner of this half of the schema, i.e. somewhere above the flat mirror, O, the vase would appear by the effect of the spherical mirror, XY, on the prop, and would unite the flowers into a whole, providing a totality for the series of concepts, making a real unity out of the merely logical unity of the self. According to both Kant and Lacan, this configuration is at work in the Cartesian foundation of cogito. The problem with Descartes' formulation, however, is that, as both Lacan and Kant realize, the subject can never occupy the position of such an ideal observer of oneself. As a subject, I am necessarily situated somewhere among the flowers, Lacan. I am a part of what the spherical mirror unites into a totality. In Kant's version, the reason for this is, of course, that he refuses to allow intellectual intuition. I cannot contemplate myself contemplating myself. No meta-language. The observer is thus necessarily placed somewhere above the flowers. The observer... I cannot contemplate myself contemplating myself. The observer is thus necessarily placed somewhere above the flowers. The I in the schema. We now introduce the second, that is the flat mirror, O, which opens up a virtual space. The right-hand part of the schema. What happens with this intervention? Although I, the subject, still find myself somewhere among the flowers, I can now see before me what is usually behind my back, the totality of myself included. I can now see in the flat mirror the coherence and unity that are an effect of the spherical mirror. In other words, What happens with the intervention of the second mirror is precisely what Kant describes as dialectical illusion. Hence arises the illusion that the lines have their source in a real object lying outside the field of empirically possible knowledge, just as objects reflected in a mirror are seen as behind it. Nevertheless, this illusion is indispensably necessary if, besides the objects which lie before our eyes, we are also to see those which lie at a distance behind our back. The I think, as a pure form of transcendental apperception, transforms itself via the notion of personality implied by this configuration into an identity which appears as if it really held in the realm of what is. The I think, as a pure form of transcendental apperception, transforms itself via the notion of personality implied by this configuration into an identity, which appears as if it really held in the realm of what is. So what happens is that which can never be can never be found in the realm of possible experience. So my transcendental unity as a subject, me as a noumenon, but this maybe is a problematic statement, but my unity, which is a transcendental idea, so I can never find myself as a unifying agent in the world. What I can find is only the passage of phenomena, and my thoughts this is like the Buddhist stuff. You can only observe the flow, there is nothing besides the flow. But Kant says there is and transcendental I, which unites all of these thoughts, so they are not just disparate phenomena. This is again contra Hume. Hume said that there is nothing besides the flow of thought. So I can never find myself, and Kant says you can, but transcendentally, not in the world. But through this idea of personality, of me of the soul, of me as the object, I can find myself in the world finally. But it's an illusion. For Lacan, imaginary. For Kant, it's the dialectic, is a part of the transcendental dialectic. Well, let's continue. In order for this illusion, as Kant calls it, to occur, the subject has to be situated between two mirrors, in such a way that he discerns in the second mirror the effect he or any other object has on the first one, the first mirror, the one that is situated behind his back. The function of the transcendental idea is to give a frame to this configuration. The function of the transcendental idea is to give a frame to this configuration. In the case of the idea of personality, it embodies the virtual point from which the subject would see himself as he is seen by the other. Analogically, on a more general level, the transcendental idea articulates the relationship between the understanding and reason. As we have already said, it is the way the understanding sees itself as seen by reason. It is interesting to observe that Kant always conceives transcendental ideas through the image of the standpoint of an observer. For example, Kant quote, "Every concept may be regarded as a point which, as the station for an observer, has its own horizon. That is, a variety of things which can be represented and, as it were, surveyed from that standpoint. But for different horizons, there can be a common horizon, in reference to which, as from a common center, they can be surveyed. And from this higher genus, we can proceed until we arrive at the highest of all genera. and so at the universal and true horizon, from which is determined from the standpoint of the highest, which is determined from the standpoint of the highest concept. End of quote. The highest concept is thus not a frame which would contain all the points of a given universe, but a point of view or standpoint from which we see all the points and from which they appear to form a unity. The highest concept is thus not a frame which would contain all the points of a given universe, but a point of view or standpoint from which we see all these points and from which they appear to form a unity. According to Kant, the subject of knowledge has no direct access to this point of view. He cannot, if we pursue the visual metaphor, see himself seeing. The possibility of such a perspective opens up only with the concept of the regulative idea that constitutes precisely the virtual point of view with which the subject identifies in order to perceive this unity. According to Kant, the subject of knowledge has no direct access to this point of view, all-encompassing point of view. He cannot, if we pursue the visual metaphor, see himself seeing. The possibility of such a perspective opens up only with the concept of the regulative idea that constitutes precisely the virtual point of view with which the subject identifies in order to perceive this unity. The paradox lies, of course, in the fact that in order to reach this unity, the subject has to lose his organic unity. Identification with this virtual point of view already requires and presupposes the division or alienation of the subject. The fact that I am perceiving myself as a person, identical in time, implies that my personhood, in its very core, is already marked by the point of view of the other. The ego ideal. In order to see myself as a coherent person, constant through time, I have to identify with the ego ideal, which is an impossible virtual point of view in the other, which sees me. So I identify, in order to go from imaginary to the symbolic, I have to identify with a non-existent virtual point of view. I have to identify with the way the other sees me. But the other does not exist. So I, in a way, create the illusion that the other sees me. The point of view, I identify with the point of view from which the other sees me and judges me. That's why the ego ideal is so close to the superego. Kant compares the transcendental idea to the transcendental schema, for which no object, not even a hypothetical one, is directly given, and which enables us to represent other objects to ourselves only indirectly, in their systematic unity, by means of their relation to this idea. Kant compares the transcendental idea to the transcendental schema, for which no object, not even a hypothetical one, is directly given, and which enables us to represent other objects to ourselves only indirectly, in their systematic unity, by means of their relation to this idea. The transcendental idea concerns the very act of representation. It is the form of the representation, not its content. We could say that the concepts of understanding and the concepts of reason, the ideas of reason, have the same content. The additional something introduced by the concepts of reason is just this point of view which shows this content in a new light. The soul, or the person, the universe, and God are these kinds of concepts. Their only content is the mode of representation of another content, the one which is already given by the concepts of the understanding. What just happened was Zupancic, Alenka explained that what reason does and what the dialectic consists of is not introducing some new object, but introducing this point of view which does not exist within the field of possible experience, but this impossible virtual. These words which appeared, which were crucial, was virtual, a virtual point of view. So this point does not exist. We cannot find it, but this point is precisely what gives consistence to our. So, for example, I cannot locate myself as a constant in experience. So yeah, but the idea of a person or of the soul means that now I can cognize myself as an individual, even though this is not empirically true, but it allows me to do things. It allows me to think things which I couldn't think before, and is a necessary illusion which allows me to act. Even though, so for the point is that for the understanding, this is nonsense. This is pure nonsense. You are not a person. There is only disparate experiences. Okay, yeah, okay, fine, that's fine. And the reason goes, no, but there is this idea. Everything points towards this fact that you are indeed a person. That there is a unity here. And this unity cannot be localized in experience, but it surely has to exist because experience implies it. So the reason introduces an object in the place where understanding necessarily says that there is a boundary and there is nothing beyond. And if you speak about what is beyond this boundary, this is nonsense. This is ridiculous. And the reason goes, nah, okay. Yeah, let's do that. Let's just go beyond the boundary. Yeah. So the illusion and the not extravagance, but controversy of reason is precisely that it introduces something where there should be nothing. And you can call it an illusion, yeah, or a reactive formation. Let's continue. The passage to the postulates. In relation to the transcendental ideas, the postulates, Kant establishes three: freedom, the immortality of the soul, and the existence of God, present a certain shift. Three of the transcendental ideas get their objects. As Kant puts it, three concepts of pure reason are now described assertorically as actually having objects. I emphasize the word assertorically because it points neatly to the basic difference between the regulative ideas and the postulates. We could say that the objects of the transcendental ideas have the structure of fictions. Kant calls them the heuristic fictions. Whereas the existence of the objects of the postulates is axiomatic. As far as the transcendental ideas are concerned, we notice, first of all, a certain hierarchy, in the sense that each new idea includes more. Thus, says Kant, the psychological ideas concern the absolute unity of the thinking subject, the cosmological ideas, the absolute unity of the series of conditions of appearance, and the theological ideas, the unity of the condition of all objects of thought in general. However, this hierarchy of gradation implies neither an interdependence of these ideas nor an all-embracing concept which would relate these ideas among themselves. It does not imply an all-embracing concept which would relate these ideas among themselves. With the postulates, the situation is slightly different. The first important difference here concerns the place and the exceptional status of the postulate of freedom. In contrast to two other postulates, which Kant develops in the dialectic of pure practical reason, the postulate of freedom is a condition and an integral part of Kant's argument in the analytic. What is more, unlike the other two postulates, which, as Kant stresses at the beginning of the dialectic, do not enter the determining ground of the will, freedom, and indissolubly linked to the moral law, is this very determining ground of the will. Let me read that again. What is more, unlike the two other postulates, which, as Kant stresses at the beginning of the dialectic, do not enter the determining ground of the will, freedom, as indissolubly linked to the moral law, is this very determining ground of the will. Thus, in the critique of practical reason, freedom does not have only the function of a postulate, but is also, as a condition of an ethics, a fact of reason. So, in a certain sense, there are only two genuine postulates: the immortality of the soul and God. The second important difference between transcendental ideas and postulates is that the postulates, or more precisely the second and third postulates, do have some other concept above them, namely the concept of the highest good, defined as the complete fitness of the will to the moral law, not as any particular good. The second important difference between transcendental ideas and postulates is that the postulates, or more precisely the second and third postulates, do have some other concept above them, namely the concept of the highest good, defined as the complete fitness of the will to the moral law, not as any particular good. The highest good is not the determining ground of the will, but its object. The immortality of the soul, as well as the existence of God, are postulated in order to make possible the realization of the highest good. So the highest good is not the condition of will, like will could exist on the level of the concept. The will does not have to pursue the highest good, like it could exist without this. It can exist without this pursuit, but it cannot exist without the idea of freedom. So freedom is the condition of the will, but these two are not. They are the object. They come after, logically. That's why she distinguished freedom from these two postulates. It is, in this respect, it is important to note not only that the highest good is situated above God and immortality, but also that the two must necessarily be postulated together. In relation to the highest good, which is the only reason why they are postulated, they are nothing without each other. It is only together that they can play the role required of them. In logical and structural terms, this role does not differ greatly from the one played by the transcendental ideas. The only crucial difference is that now the point of view of the understanding and the point of view of reason become, so to speak, personified. Schematically speaking, the postulate of the immortality of the soul concerns the possibility of an infinite progress towards the ideal of the complete conformity of the will to the moral law, which would be the highest good. Since life is too short for us to attain this perfection, we postulate the possibility of an ongoing improvement, a kind of life after life, which would make possible the continuation of moral progress. It is here that the difference between the 2 points of view intervenes. Thus the necessity arises of linking the postulate of God to the postulate of immortality. The infinite existence of subjects does not in itself make possible the highest good. It does not yet give us access to it. It is only the perspective of God's point of view that makes it possible, since it is only from the point of view of God that this infinite duration appears as a whole, W-H-O-L-E, as a unity. In relation to the regulative ideas, we stressed that their role was to articulate the point of view of understanding with that of reason. The understanding is immersed in the task of the creation of concepts and series of concepts, which is why, as Kant himself puts it, it never sees their totality. The latter is visible, the totality is visible only from the point of view of reason. If the understanding is to take notice of the directives provided by reason, it has to operate in such a way that it identifies itself with the point of view from which it is seen by reason. With the postulates, this constellation becomes, so to speak, materialized. Now, it is the ethical subject who embodies the perspective of the understanding. The subject is directly engaged and immersed in the infinite process of improvement, busy creating a moral series of his existence, which is why he can never see its totality. God, on the other hand, embodies the point of view of reason, which sees this series as a totality. Kant quote: "The infinite being, to whom the temporal condition is nothing, sees in this series, which is for us without end, a whole, W-H-O-L-E, conformable to moral law. A man cannot hope here or at any foreseeable point of his future existence to be fully adequate to God's will. This he can do only in the infinity of his duration, which God alone can survey." End of quote. It is interesting to see how, in this passage, Kant establishes a difference between the infinite being and the infinite existence of a being. When he says that for the infinite being, the temporal condition is nothing, this implies that for the immortal soul, the temporal condition remains valid. In this perspective, the postulate of immortality turns out to be a quite an unusual one. The immortality of the soul postulates nothing supersensible, only the infinite duration of the sensible, which remains dependent on the temporal condition. This was we really sailed through the sea of dialectical illusion here. The outstanding link of reason to God, to ego idea in Lacan, I think this is the crucial point here. That the passage from understanding to reason and then to the transcendental idea and postulates marks the creation of a virtuality which allows us to think the ethical subject, and in this way ethics, which goes beyond the simple field of possible experience. Because this field of experience, if we go back to Lacan, would be the field of the pleasure principle. And if we stayed within it, the only ethics possible would be utilitarianism or some sort of a virtue ethic. What she wants to do here is to go, what she says that Kant does is to go beyond this, because if you stay in this field, you have to make the good the condition of you have to make the good the condition of the will. And precisely this is not what the whole of Kant's ethics goes contra to this. Like the good is not the condition of the will. The condition of the will is freedom. And in order to postulate freedom of the subject as fundamental, you have to create this virtual point of view. Because if you don't, then you cannot prove that the subject is free. This idea of freedom remains the pure dialectical illusion. And Kant, he perfectly well understands it. And in the critique of pure reason, this is not legitimate. Like freedom, no, not in the field of phenomena. Only on the splitting point between noumenon and phenomenon. But this is only in practical reason. And here she basically traced out the way the point of view from which freedom is not only a postulate, but as she accentuated, it's a fact of reason. It's the most basic fact for Kant. How this fact is traced out from where we can see it. Thanks, and see you at the next chapter.